Numbers don't lie. People do. Della Wray had known this since she was 14 years old, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a red pen, catching the falsified line in a lease agreement before her mother could sign it. The landlord had screamed. Her mother had cried. They'd moved the following week, but Della had kept the pen. She became a woman who fixed other people's numbers. Hospital billing. Corporate audits. 18 months ago, she'd been hired as an external financial auditor for Strand Logistics Group, a mid-sized operation with a footprint across 7 states and a set of books so immaculate they made her suspicious. Nobody's books were that clean. She'd spent the better part of a year quietly circling the edges of the ledgers, looking for the seam where the real numbers were hiding. She had not found them yet. She had not, until tonight, fully grasped why. The event was called a stakeholder dinner. Her supervisor told her to attend, dress professionally, be charming. Della owned one dress that qualified, a navy wrap she'd bought secondhand, already worn to 3 of these things. She'd arrived at the Linden Club at 7:04, taken her assigned seat at the round table, and found herself beside a man named Briggs. He was smooth in the way that men with money and patience were smooth. Tailored jacket, good watch. The kind of even, pleasant face that revealed nothing until it chose to. He asked her about her work. She gave him the standard vague answer she gave strangers: financial analysis, logistics sector, and he nodded pleasantly and ordered a bourbon. By the 3rd bourbon, he stopped pretending. "You run the compliance reports," he said. Not a question. His eyes tracked her reaction like a man reading a weather gauge. "The quarterly ones. You restructured the routing code last fall, saved them $900,000 in liability exposure." Della's hands went still on her wine glass. "I work in auditing," she said carefully. "You work for Strand." Something in his voice changed, flattened into a register with no warmth in it. "We've been watching the organization for a while. We thought it was useful to meet the person who keeps his numbers clean." She excused herself to find the restroom. She didn't go back to the table. The women's restroom was all white marble and recessed lighting, the kind of place that spent money looking like it wasn't trying. Della pushed into the last stall, turned the lock, and stood with her back against the cold metal door. Her heart was slamming against the inside of her chest, with nothing to do with the wine. She opened her phone with hands that weren't quite steady. Her sister was in Columbus and wouldn't understand. Her lawyer didn't pick up after 5. There were 3 numbers on her phone connected to Strand Logistics Group. She'd never used any of them except for scheduling. She stared at the one labeled General Inquiries, Executive Line, and understood, with the particular clarity of fear, that she had no other option. She pressed call. It rang twice. The man who answered didn't say hello. "Speak." The voice was low and without inflection. The kind of voice that didn't waste itself on warmth. She'd heard it exactly once before, in the hallway outside the accounting department, when she'd handed a quarterly report directly to the man who ran the company instead of his assistant. He'd taken the folder without looking at her and said, "This had better be right." She'd said, "It always is." He hadn't responded, but he hadn't walked away either, which she'd taken as the closest thing to a compliment she was likely to get. "This is Della Wray," she said. Her voice was steadier than expected. "I'm the external auditor. I'm at the Linden Club on West Harmon, and there's a man named Briggs at my dinner table who knows I work for you. He knew specifics about my work that aren't in any public document." She stopped, took one careful breath. "I don't know who he works for. I don't know what he wants. I need to know if I should call the police or—" "Don't call the police. Flat. Immediate." The silence that followed was short, but heavy enough that she felt it. "Are you in a secure location right now?" "I'm in a bathroom stall." A beat. "Stay there. Don't open the door for anyone." "Mr. Strand, how long ago did you leave the table?" She checked her phone. 4 minutes. That sound, she would later think, was the sound of a man recalculating. "He'll come looking within 10. Can you keep the stall locked?" "Yes." "Then lock it and stay on the line. A pause and then, quieter and with a precision that made her ribs tighten, "Della, are you all right?" She was not all right. She was standing on cold marble in a second-hand dress with her heart in her throat. But she said, "I'm fine," because she had learned, a long time ago, that admitting to fear only made it larger. "I'm sending someone." How long? 12 minutes. She leaned her forehead back against the stall door. Outside, the ambient noise of the restaurant filtered through the walls, muffled conversation, the scrape of cutlery. Normal, mundane, as if the world hadn't been quietly tilted on its axis. "Mr. Strand," she said, "I think I know what those books are hiding." The silence this time lasted 3 full seconds. "We'll talk about that later," he said. He didn't hang up. 43 miles south, in the back room of a warehouse handling refrigerated goods at the Meridian port, Grant Strand stood in his overcoat and said nothing for a long moment. Around him, 2 of his men waited. A dock worker who'd been skimming from their inventory sat in a chair by the wall, looking like a man beginning to understand the full scale of his mistake. Strand had intended to spend another 20 minutes in this room. He had a particular way of conducting these conversations, unhurried, methodical, the way you balance a ledger entry by entry before arriving at the final sum. He put the phone in his inside pocket without hanging up, kept the line open. "Get him out of here," Strand said to his men. "Take care of it." His right-hand man, a compact and quiet individual named Hux, who had been with him for 11 years, fell into step beside him as he moved toward the exit. "Where are we going?" Hux asked. "Linden Club." Strand pushed through the exterior door into the cold air. "Briggs is there." Hux's jaw tightened. "Keen's man, that's deliberate." "Obviously." Strand didn't slow his stride. "He's sitting across from my auditor. Pull the car around." Hux didn't argue. He'd learned, over 11 years, which silences from Strand were questions and which were commands. This was a command with a wall behind it. Strand drove himself. He did not typically drive himself to anything, but Hux had stopped asking about that 3 years ago. He wove through the city with the practiced efficiency of a man who had memorized every shortcut in the grid. 11 minutes. The Linden Club sat on the west edge of the financial district, a place that believed it was more important than it was. He left the car on the curb, handed the keys to Hux without looking, and went through the front doors. The host began a sentence. Strand walked past him. He knew the layout of this building. He knew the layout of every building where he had business. The restrooms were at the back of the main floor, past the bar, through a frosted glass partition. He passed the table where the dinner was still ongoing, did not look at it directly, but registered in his peripheral vision the empty chair, the half-empty wine glass, and Briggs still sitting, checking his phone with the careful patience of a man who believed he had time. He did not have time. Strand stopped outside the women's restroom. He knocked twice, quietly. "It's me," he said. A pause, then the sound of a lock sliding. The door opened 3 inches. Della looked at him through the gap the way a person looks at something they're not sure is real. She was pale. There was a controlled quality to her stillness, the kind that comes from telling yourself to hold it together so many times that you've made it a reflex. She had her phone gripped in one hand and her purse in the other, and she was holding both the way someone holds things they're not sure they'll get to keep. He pushed the door open. "Let's go," he said. She came out without asking questions, which told him something about her. He put his hand on the small of her back, brief, directional, and guided her away from the dining room instead of toward it, down a sassed corridor running along the kitchen, through a service exit, into the cold air of the alley behind the building, where Hux was waiting with the engine already running. She got in, he got in after her. Neither of them spoke until they were a full block away. "Briggs," she said. "Keen Syndicate." Strand was watching the side mirror with the same expression he'd had across from the dock worker, measuring. Calculating, mid-level, smart enough to be useful to them, not smart enough to know what useful means. He paused. "He didn't touch you." not quite a question. No, she looked at her hands in her lap. He just talked. He wanted me to know that he knew. He was establishing leverage. I understood that. There was a thread of sharpness in her voice. Not anger exactly, but the friction of someone tired of being underestimated. She took a breath. Let it out. He'll try again, whoever he works for. They want something about your operation, something they think I have access to. You don't. I know I don't. She turned to look at him. In the dark of the back seat, with city light cutting across his face in strips, he looked older than she'd estimated, and harder. The kind of man who didn't get that way by accident. But I've been auditing your books for 18 months, and I can see where the clean layer ends. I can see the seam. I haven't said anything because... She stopped. Because you needed the job, he said. Because the math was interesting, she corrected quietly, and I hadn't finished working out where it led. He looked at her for a moment. Then, very slightly, the corner of his mouth moved. Where does your apartment sit relative to Keene territory? He asked. Dalton Street, East Side. That's a problem. She already knew it was a problem. How much of one? Enough that you're not going back tonight. She didn't protest. She knew how the geometry of situations like this worked, even if she'd never been inside one before. The moment Briggs reported back, someone would go check her address. She'd read enough in 18 months to understand that much. Okay, she said. He looked at her again, like he was checking something. Okay, he agreed. Strand's apartment occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district with a private elevator and windows running floor to ceiling on 3 sides. It was not what she'd imagined. She'd spent 18 months auditing his finances and had deliberately avoided imagining what kind of man built them. It was spare, dark wood, dark leather, the minimal geometry of someone who had stripped a life down to its functional parts. No art, no photographs. A single plant by the east window that was, she noticed, actually alive, which surprised her more than anything else had that night. Guest room is the second door on the left, he said. There's a lock. She took the lock comment at face value and didn't examine it further. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay on the guest bed in her navy wrap dress and ran numbers in her head. Not the ones she'd been auditing officially, the other ones. The ones that made the clean numbers possible. She'd been building the equation in the back of her mind for months, careful and instinctive, the way she'd built every equation since she was 14 years old. She was close to understanding what it all added up to. In the morning, the main room was occupied. She counted 4 men she didn't recognize, plus Hucks. They were gathered around the dining table with laptops and phones and coffee that smelled burnt. A city map was spread across the granite, held flat by a ceramic mug. Strand was standing at the window. He was wearing a dark Henley, sleeves pushed up, arms crossed, looking out at the city with the focused blankness of a man running scenarios. There was a healing cut along his jaw she hadn't noticed the night before. In the full light of morning, he looked less like a logistics executive and exactly like what he was. Something that had survived a long time in a world that didn't reward survival. He turned when she came in. The conversation in the room dimmed slightly. Morning, Della said. She was still in yesterday's dress. She made a decision about this. It was not her problem. She walked to the kitchen counter, where the coffee maker sat unused beside a full bag of beans. She looked at the men around the table. Has anyone made coffee? One of them, broad-shouldered, introduced to her later as Garth, looked at the machine with open suspicion. That thing's got about 600 buttons. It's a pour-over, 3 buttons. She found a mug, found the beans, and started working. It gave her something to do with her hands while her brain caught up with the room. Behind her, the conversation resumed. Keene pulled 3 of his people off the Eastern contracts overnight, someone was saying. They're consolidating toward the port. He knows last night didn't go the way Briggs planned, Strand said. He's going to hit the warehouses. No, Della didn't turn around. She heard the silence land and kept her hands steady. He'll hit the holding accounts first. The warehouses are visible. The accounts aren't. She poured water. If someone wanted to damage this operation quickly and quietly, they'd freeze your liquidity. You can't run a port with frozen capital. The silence held for 2 seconds. She turned around with a mug and set it on the table in front of Strand, who was now standing 4 feet from her. He looked at the mug, then at her. "Which accounts?" he said, not a question in the usual sense. "I'd need to see the full ledger." She met his eyes, the real one. A beat. 2, the men around the table were very carefully not looking at anything. "Hux," Strand said. "Yeah," Hux said. "Get her access." What followed was 2 days of sustained work. Della sat at the corner of the table with a laptop and a notepad and went through the real architecture of the Strand Syndicate's finances the way she went through everything. Methodically, without flinching. It was cleaner than she'd expected in some ways, ruthless in others. There were payment structures she recognized from organized crime methodology, and a few she'd never seen before, which were elegant enough to be genuinely interesting. She froze 3 of Keen's account access points by forging authorization codes through a shell company they'd been using as a payment relay. She did it in 20 minutes and told no one she was going to do it until after it was done. Strand looked at the screen, looked at her. "You just locked them out of their own relay," he said. "I locked them out of yours, which they'd been piggybacking for 14 months. She turned the laptop so he could see the access logs. "They've been siphoning margin payments through your West Coast routing. Small amounts. Your clean accountants wouldn't have caught it because the figures fell under the flag threshold. But you caught it. I catch everything, not boastfully, as a statement of observable fact." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Why didn't you tell me 14 months ago?" "I didn't know who you were 14 months ago." She held his gaze. "I knew you were running something I couldn't fully see. I didn't know if the problem was internal or external. I had to be sure before I said anything. And now you're sure." "Now I have the full ledger." She clicked to a new screen. "Yes, I'm sure." That night, Hux took a team to the Keen organization's primary financial relay, a suite of offices above a dry cleaner on the west side. Della sat at the table with a headset, walking them through the server room layout from a building schematic she'd pulled from a public zoning database. Strand sat across from her, watching the operation unfold through a communications line she was half managing. When it was over, Hux's voice came through the earpiece with characteristic brevity. "Clean." Della pulled the headset off and set it on the table. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them with detached interest, the way she'd look at a column that had come out to an unexpected sum. Strand reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not gripping, just covering, heavy and warm and still. She looked up. "It's done," he said. "I know." She let out a breath that had been compressed somewhere in her ribcage for 2 days. "Is it always like this?" A pause. "Usually there's less math." She laughed. Rue and real, tiredness and adrenaline mixed together. He watched it happen with an expression that was difficult to read, something held carefully just below the surface. He didn't take his hand away. "Briggs is in federal holding," he said. "The Keen operation is fractured. You're not a target anymore." "Okay. You could go home." She looked at him. "You said my apartment was compromised." "It was. It's secured now. We had it handled this morning." "Oh," she absorbed this, "so you're saying I can leave?" "I'm saying you can." He said it with a careful precision that made her hear what was underneath it. The kitchen was quiet. The city beyond the windows was dark and still, the kind of still that came after the worst was over. Della looked at the hand covering hers, at the scar along the edge of his knuckle that she'd noticed on the first day, and filed away without comment. At the careful way he was holding himself very still, like a man who had learned patience with things he couldn't control. "When I was 14, she said, I fixed a fraudulent lease agreement with a red pen. The landlord said I didn't know what I was doing. My mother told me to put the pen down. She paused. I didn't. Strand said nothing. I have been every version of not good enough that it's possible to be for most of my life. Bad neighborhood, wrong school, wrong accent, wrong everything. She met his eyes. I am very tired of making myself small so other people feel comfortable. You're not small, he said. The words came out flat and certain, the way his words always came out, undecorated, unpadded, placed precisely where they were meant to be. I know that, she said. I just needed to say it out loud. He studied her face for a long moment. The position you've been filling, he said. External auditor, contract basis. Yes. I want to restructure it. To what? Something with actual authority. A pause, and a desk that isn't in a hallway. Della looked at him for a long moment, at the city behind him, at the map still spread on the table with her handwriting in the margins. I want access to the full ledger going forward, she said. All of it, no sanitized version. That's a significant ask. I know what it is. She kept her eyes on his. I also know what I just did with 14 months of partial information. Imagine what I could do with all of it. The silence lasted long enough that she felt the full weight of it. Then Strand stood. He picked up the coffee mug she'd given him that morning, still on the table, long cold, and carried it to the sink. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. Monday, he said. I'll have the system access updated. You'll need to sign a new contract. That's fine. It binds you to confidentiality under terms that are not standard. I assumed, she said. He turned around. There was something different in his face, not softened, but something that had been held at a distance, pulled one careful inch closer. She had learned in 48 hours that Grant Strand was a man who conducted every transaction, financial, personal, human, according to a precise internal ledger of debts and values. She understood that ledger. She was fluent in it. She stood up from the table. I'm going to sleep, she said, and tomorrow I want coffee that isn't burnt. The machine has 600 buttons, he said. It has 3, she said. I'll show you. She walked toward the hallway. She didn't look back, but she heard him, the quiet exhale of a man who had spent a very long time alone in a room deciding things, and who had just decided something new. 6 months later, the Strand Syndicate operated out of the 22nd floor of a glass building in the financial district, with a legitimate import-export front that could survive any audit. It could survive any audit because Della had designed the audit protocols herself. She came in at 7:45 on a Tuesday, set her bag on the desk that was now hers. Corner office east-facing, direct view of the port, and opened the real ledger on one screen and the clean version on the other. The morning light fell across both of them evenly. Hux knocked at 8. Strand wants you in the conference room. Port Authority renegotiation. Tell him I'll be there in 10. She didn't look up, and tell him the Vega account is going to flag in the Q3 report if he doesn't let me move those payments before Friday. A pause, I'll pass that along. Thank you, Hux. She finished what she was doing. Then she walked down the hall to the conference room, where 4 men in suits were waiting, and Strand was at the head of the table. He saw her come in and shifted his chair half an inch, a small, unconscious thing she'd only recently started noticing. So there was room beside him. She sat down. Under the table, his hand found hers briefly, 2 fingers only, the way he always did in rooms where neither of them could show anything. She didn't look at him. She opened her portfolio and looked at the men across the table. Let's start with the Port Authority's liability exposure, she said. I've run the numbers, and there are a few things they're going to need to understand before we get to the contract terms. The men looked at her, then at Strand. Strand was looking out the window. You heard her, he said. The woman who had fixed her mother's lease with a red pen at 14 had spent her whole life being told she didn't belong in the room. She'd put herself into every room anyway. Wrong clothes, wrong school, wrong everything, and fixed things until the room rearranged itself around her. She was done apologizing for any of it. The numbers were hers. The ledger was hers. The man at the head of the table, cold and scarred and exacting, who had once said, "You're not small," in a voice that cost him something to use. He was hers too, in the quiet and unannounced way that two people with no patience for sentimentality claim each other. The city hummed beyond the glass and swallowed its own secrets, the way it always had. Della opened her notebook to the first page and began.